In January 1943, in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States, took a detour that would quietly reshape the post-war world. He wasn't visiting a battlefield. He wasn't meeting a general. He was passing through a tiny, forgotten strip of West Africa called British Gambia. And what he saw there horrified him so deeply that it changed the trajectory of his thinking on colonialism, empire, and ultimately, the creation of the United Nations. This is the story of how one brief stop in one of the British Empire's most neglected colonies helped set the stage for the end of European colonialism in Africa. The setup: a secret wartime journey. Let's set the scene. By late 1942, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. Allied forces had taken the upper hand in North Africa, the Soviet Red Army had surrounded German divisions at Stalingrad, and the Japanese advance in the Pacific had been blunted. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed it was time to meet in person to plan the next phase of the war. The location? Casablanca, Morocco. But getting there would be an adventure in itself. Roosevelt departed Washington in total secrecy on January 9, 1943. He boarded a train under cover of night at a hidden siding behind the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The train initially headed north as if going to Hyde Park, then doubled back south through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and into Florida. From Miami, the president boarded a Boeing Clipper, a massive 4-engine seaplane, and in doing so, became the first sitting American president to fly while in office. He was also the first president since Abraham Lincoln to visit an active theater of war. Roosevelt loved every second of it. His aide Harry Hopkins later admitted that the president's main motivation for the trip was, frankly, just the thrill of the journey. He was, according to Hopkins, acting like he was on a first-class holiday. The route to Casablanca was deliberately indirect for security reasons, from Miami to Trinidad, then to Brazil, and finally across the Atlantic to Bathurst, the capital of Britain's tiny Gambia colony on the West African coast. From there, military transport planes would fly the party the final stretch to Casablanca. It was that stopover in Bathurst that changed everything. The hellhole. When Roosevelt's seaplane touched down on the Gambia River on January 14, 1943, it was late afternoon. Rather than going directly to the USS Memphis, the Navy cruiser that would serve as his overnight quarters, Roosevelt insisted on taking a reconnaissance tour of the port by motorboat. What he saw from the water was shocking. The docks were grimy and crumbling. Between them sat abandoned, rust-covered barges that had been converted into makeshift homes for families. Children and their parents were crammed onto these derelict vessels. The evening breeze carried the stench of rotten fish and raw sewage. The next morning, the president was driven through the streets of Bathurst on the way to the airfield at Yundum, and it was this ride that truly seared itself into his memory. He saw residents in rags, gaunt and malnourished, shuffling to work in the early chill. Women balancing jugs of palm wine on their heads walked past crumbling huts packed with skinny, underfed children. Street vendors sold fish heads as a local delicacy. The party passed through a notorious swamp that collected the town's runoff and bred clouds of malarial mosquitoes. Scores of people had slept on the streets the night before. Just weeks earlier, police had rounded up 800 people sleeping in the open. Roosevelt learned that the prevailing daily wage in Bathurst was 1 shilling and 9 pence, less than 50 cents a day. Workers also received a half cup of rice. Life expectancy in the colony was just 26 years. The president was stunned. That night, after arriving in Casablanca, he couldn't stop talking about it to his son Elliot. "Those people are treated worse than the livestock," he said. "Their cattle live longer." Now, to be clear, Bathurst was not just having a bad day. It had always been a miserable place. The British Colonial Office had founded the settlement back in 1816 on Banjul Island, a low-lying sandbar at the mouth of the Gambia River. It was chosen because it was defensible and had a deep-water harbour, useful for the Royal Navy's anti-slavery patrols. But as a place for human beings to live, it was awful. The low, sandy ground flooded regularly, creating perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. When the British first garrisoned it in 1825, they brought out 199 soldiers. By Christmas, 160 of them were dead. The end of town where Roosevelt's motorcade began was known with grim humour as Half Die. A colony bled dry. The conditions Roosevelt witnessed weren't an accident of geography alone. They were the direct result of decades of deliberate neglect. Britain's approach to its colonies was simple. Colonial peoples should pay for their own administration. In Gambia, this meant the economy was built almost entirely around peanut exports. Gambian farmers were encouraged to grow peanuts at the expense of their own food crops, millet and rice. When peanut prices were high and rice was cheap, people could eat. When peanut prices crashed, they starved. There was also the question of development, or rather the lack of it. The Colonial Office had a peculiar excuse for not investing in Gambia. They were worried they might one day hand the colony over to France, since French Senegal surrounded it on all sides. Any money spent on development, they reasoned, would be lost to the empire. So instead, colonial revenues piled up in reserves. In 1925, the government allocated just £3,500 for education and under £25,000 for medical services. By 1940, less than 1% of the colony's 200,000 people were receiving any education at all, and a British medical officer labelled Gambia's lone hospital the worst in the entire colonial empire. A journalist named Morley Richards, writing in the Daily Express in 1939, captured the situation perfectly. He questioned whether Gambians had truly escaped slavery, given how heavily they were taxed on everything: their food, their exports, even the peanuts that were their only real source of income. They were, he argued, in bondage from cradle to grave, taxed to pay salaries to white administrators who did little to develop the country. Then the war made everything worse. The closing of the Mediterranean turned Bathurst into an important Allied air and sea base. Construction work drew people from upriver. The city's population doubled from 10,000 to 20,000 between 1939 and 1944, but wartime shipping was tied up, and the usual rice suppliers, Burma and Java, were in enemy hands. By 1942, a British medical officer noted that many civilians were eating only one meal every 3 days. Housing was non-existent. The military had evicted people from 51 acres of the most populated section of town to build facilities. Disease was rampant. Malaria, respiratory illness, yaws, trachoma, intestinal worms, syphilis, gonorrhea, and leprosy. A professor from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine had described Bathurst as being like a waterlogged sponge floating in a sea of its own waste. This was the city that the President of the United States drove through in January 1943, Roosevelt versus Churchill. Now, Roosevelt had never been a fan of European colonialism. Like many Americans, he believed that the Self-Determination Clause of the 1941 Atlantic Charter, the joint declaration he and Churchill had signed, should apply to all peoples, not just Europeans. Churchill disagreed. He had publicly declared that he had not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. The two leaders had an unspoken agreement to avoid the subject. Bathurst ended that ceasefire. At the Casablanca conference, Roosevelt brought up Gambia directly with Churchill in private conversations. Then, at a dinner he hosted in honour of the Sultan of Morocco on January 22nd, he spoke openly about colonial independence and the need to end imperialism after the war. Churchill and the French resident general could not help but overhear. British diplomat Harold Macmillan described the conversation as equally embarrassing for the British and the French. American diplomat Robert Murphy called it deliberately provocative. After returning from Casablanca, Roosevelt kept hammering the point. At a press conference, he spoke about the problems of the West African coast that he had never visualized before his visit. He regularly badgered Churchill about conditions in Bathurst. Churchill, under pressure, passed the complaints to the Colonial Office, which acknowledged that American visitors to Bathurst had not been sparing in their criticism. The Prime Minister eventually extracted a promise from the Secretary of State for the colonies to do something about Bathurst, and a plan was drafted to drain the swamps and relocate half the town's population. But the cost was deemed too high, and meaningful investment in Gambia didn't come until the 1950s. And even then, the spending was minimal. The bigger picture: the United Nations. But Roosevelt's encounter with Gambia had consequences far beyond one small colony. That night in the presidential villa in Casablanca, Roosevelt spoke to his son Elliot for the first time about his vision for an organization of the United Nations, one that would take an active role in raising living standards, improving health, and expanding education in colonial territories around the world. And when those peoples had matured, he said, they must be given the opportunity for independence. Over the final 2 years of his life, Roosevelt pushed relentlessly for this vision. In June 1943, he told his aide Charles Taussig that he was getting nowhere with the British on colonial policy, calling them impossible on the issue. In February 1944, speaking to the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association, he described Bathurst as the most horrible thing he had ever seen in his life. He explained how he was pressing Churchill to accept United Nations inspection of colonies, using Gambia as his prime example. If Britain didn't come up to scratch, the whole world would know. Roosevelt later recounted to Taussig how Churchill had responded, imitating the Prime Minister's voice: "We are not going to let any other nation inspect or report on conditions in British territory." But Roosevelt was relentless. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, he won agreement from both Stalin and Churchill for including a trusteeship principle in the United Nations Charter, the idea that colonial territories should be placed under international supervision with the goal of eventual independence. He launched what he called pitiless publicity against the British and French empires, believing that public exposure of colonial conditions would build support for decolonization. Roosevelt died in April 1945, just months before the United Nations Charter was finalized at the San Francisco Conference, but his fingerprints were all over the chapters dealing with colonies and international trusteeship. Those provisions would become a cornerstone of the post-war wave of decolonization that swept Africa and Asia. The Gambia itself became the last British colony in West Africa to gain independence in 1965, with what one historian described as only minimal facilities provided by 70 years of British administration. It remains one of the poorest nations on Earth today. Conclusion. So, what's the connection between Roosevelt, British Gambia, and World War II? It's this: sometimes the most consequential moments in history aren't battles or treaties. Sometimes they're a morning car ride through a forgotten colonial town. Roosevelt had opposed colonialism in the abstract for years, but it was Bathurst, the rags, the disease, the fish heads, the people sleeping in the streets, that put a human face on it. 3 nights on a cruiser and a few drives through Churchill's, in Roosevelt's own words, hellhole of a colonial capital were all the exposure he needed. As historian William Roger Lewis wrote, for his championing of the ultimate goal of colonial independence through the United Nations, Roosevelt should be regarded as one of the fathers of the post-war world of politically independent nations. And it started with a stopover in the smallest, most neglected colony in the British Empire. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.